Hi there, it's Dr. Gianna Reams. I haven't made a video in a while for a couple of reasons. One, just I've been insanely busy. As I kind of mentioned, September was nuts. Also, I'm having some computer issues, so I'm actually recording this one on my phone. And today we're going to continue on with Krateros and Hephaistion, in this case, mostly with Krateros. And do a little bit of actual source criticism. I keep talking about you got to compare the sources and you got to see what the sources say. So I thought this might be an interesting way to show you exactly what I'm talking about by looking at the death of Krateros. Right. So part of the reason I got interested in these guys, Krateros and Hephaistion, I've been interested in Hephaistion a while and Krateros as well, is that there's not really been a lot done with them. And part of why they didn't have a lot written about them is even though they were the two most important people at Alexander's court, up until their deaths or until Alexander's death, but they died too soon. So Hephaistion died about 8 or 9 months before Alexander. We're not sure if he died in October or November of 324, and then Alexander died June 10th or thereabouts of 323. Maybe June 11th if the Babylonian Chronicle is correct, which it might be. Krateros didn't outlive Alexander by even 2 years. He was killed in battle. And so neither of them were actually players in the successor wars that came after. As a result, they weren't a Ptolemy, they weren't a Perdiccas, they weren't a Seleucus, Cassandros, any of those guys. So we haven't really had a lot about them. But the two of them are used by our sources to talk about politics at the court. So Krateros embodies the Macedonians, old Macedon, traditional Macedonian values. And Hephaistion is Alexander too. And so he's kind of a stand-in for Alexander. And so our sources, especially sources like Hirtius and we'll see Plutarch, tend to use them in contrast with each other to display friction between those two groups at Alexander's court. And I'll talk about this fairly dramatically in the famous incident of the sword pulling in India, in an article that's coming out in Krateros probably this summer of 2026. So I don't want to say too much about that right now. I'll discuss that later. And of course, I'm writing about them in the book, these two guys. So I thought that I would tackle the death of Krateros just to kind of show you how our sources take events and then mutate them to suit the story they want to tell. Okay. So Krateros died, like I said, not quite 2 years after Alexander died in the summer of 323. So he lives to about 321-ish. And we hear about his death in 3 different sources. 2 of them also wrote about, all of them wrote about Alexander as well. But one of them is in fragments, so we don't have a complete narrative from that one. Actually, we have a summary. It's not even the narrative itself. And that source is Arrian. And Arrian wrote a book called After Alexander, which we don't have. Okay. It is summarized by a guy named Photius of Byzantium. He was the patriarch of Constantinople and a scholar. He lived from about 815 to 897. So he is Byzantine. He is not even Roman. Okay. This is 1,000 years after Alexander lived. And he summarizes for us Arrian's works in these what we call various fragmenta. So these are the fragmenta number 9 on Arrian's after Alexander from Photius, which is a summary by Photius of Arrian's book 7. So we're not even getting what Arrian himself said. We're getting Photius's, Reader's Digest version of what Arrian said. Our next source is Diodorus, and Diodorus is actually the earliest source we have on Alexander and the time of the successors. And so Philip is book 16. Okay, and remember, Diodorus is writing world histories. He's interested in seeing how things relate, and then he does this weird thing with book 17 on Alexander, where he just laser focuses on Alexander. There are some chunks missing from Diodorus, these things we call lacunae, or blank spots, in whole pieces of some of the books. Book 5, I think it is, if I remember right. Or there are big missing pieces. Then we get to book 18, and from 18 to 20, we get the successor wars. And these are a lot more problematic because they're a lot more fragmented. Things have just been lost. They've not come down. But we do have in book 18, 29:4 to 36, if you want to go look it up, the account of the death of Krateros in the battle. And then our fullest account is in Eumenes, the Life of Eumenes by Plutarch, okay? And that's Plutarch, Life of Eumenes, 5 to 7, okay? Plutarch and Arrian are not contemporaries, but they both belong to that second sophistic era I was talking about, that are Greeks living under the Roman Empire, kind of reacting to the Roman Empire in remembering the glory days of Greek independence. And of course, Arrian himself was a friend of Hadrian. So this again gives you a sense of timing, that they're a long ways from Alexander. So Diodorus is earlier. Diodorus is the collapse of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. And then by the time we get to Plutarch and certainly Arrian, we are in the height of the Roman Empire. Okay, so, basically post-Nero, okay, or Nero and on. And that colors how they want to talk about Alexander in what came after the successor wars. And so I'm picking out the death of Krateros because it's really very interesting. We have two versions kind of agree, and then we have Plutarch, who, as I've warned, Plutarch likes to tell stories, and he takes events and he elaborates on them. He makes a story. He dramatizes them. Plutarch and Hollywood get along just fine. But these earlier sources don't. So I'm actually going to begin with the shortest. We've got two kind of shortish ones. So I'm going to start with Photius's summary of what Arrian tells us in book 7. And book 7 covers a lot of things. I am going to strip it right down to the bit about the death, okay, of Krateros. It's in Arrian that we get a lot of the backroom deals and things that are going on that we don't actually hear about in the Eumenes. And we get a little more on in Diodorus, but Diodorus slims it down. So again, this is a summary of what Arrian said. So reading from this, and this is the Brill's New Jacoby version of it. And it says, this is at Fragmenta 9:26, at this time, Eumenes brought gifts from Perdiccas to Cleopatra at Sardis, since Perdiccas had decided that he would repudiate Nicaea and marry Cleopatra instead. So Nicaea is Antipatros' daughter, and so they were going to make an alliance. And then he gets this offer from Cleopatra, Alexander's full sister. Yeah. He likes that one better, so he's going to go with that. When this had become known to Antigonus, okay, he revealed, I'm skipping over a few things, he revealed it to Antipatros and Krateros, who were in league following Alexander's death, who were thus even more inclined to make war on Perdiccas. They were mad at him for some other things. Antipatros and Krateros crossed the Hellespont from the Chersonesos, winning over through embassies those guarding the straits. They also sent embassies to Eumenes and Neoptolemus, who were under Perdiccas. Okay? So Eumenes is Alexander's secretary, who turns out to have a bit of a military edge. Neoptolemus is some noble from Epirus, probably related to Olympias. We're not as sure. Neoptolemus was persuaded, but Eumenes was not. Neoptolemus therefore became suspicious of Eumenes. War broke out between them, and Eumenes was victorious. So again, this is a quick summary of stuff that'll be in more detail in other sources that I'll be skipping over some of this. Okay. Neoptolemus fled to Antipatros and Krateros with a few men, and persuaded them to send Krateros with him in alliance against Eumenes. So they both, Neoptolemus and Krateros, fought Eumenes. Eumenes did everything to hide from his troops the fact that Krateros was fighting, in order that they would not succumb to his fame or go over to his side. Or, if they remained with him, Eumenes, become disheartened. These tricks were successful, and Eumenes won the battle. Neoptolemus, a military man and distinguished in many battles, fell on the right hand of the secretary of Eumenes. Now, Plutarch turns this into a mano-a-mano battle, one-on-one. Who knows if that really happened, but here they're saying that he fell to Eumenes. While Krateros was killed by some Paphlagonians as he boldly fought everyone, making himself known throughout the battlefield. But he was overcome and fell unrecognized, even though he had removed his causia, this special hat, from his head. The infantry, however, was saved and made its way from the battle to Antipatros, which greatly lessened his disappointment. So he loses Krateros, but he gets the troops, so it's like, okay. So that's Arrian's, via Photius's summary account of how Krateros died. Some Paphlagonians got him. He fought bravely, but then he fell. All right, so that's that version. Now, let's hear what Diodorus says about this particular battle. When Krateros and Antipatros had brought their forces across from Europe, Neoptolemus, who was jealous of Eumenes and had a considerable number of Macedonians in his following, secretly entered into negotiations with Antipatros, came to an agreement with him, and plotted against Eumenes. Okay. On being discovered and forced to fight, he himself was in danger of being killed, and he lost almost all of his forces. For Eumenes, after he had won the victory and had killed many, won over the remaining soldiers and increased his own power, not only by the victory, but also by having acquired a large number of stout Macedonians. But Neoptolemus, who had saved himself from the battle with 300 horsemen, rode off with them to Antipatros. A council of war was held, and it was decided to divide the forces into two parts. Antipatros was to take one part and set out for Cilicia to fight against Perdiccas, and Krateros, with the other part, was to attack Eumenes, and after defeating him, to join Antipatros. In this way, when they combined their forces and had added Ptolemy to the alliance, they might be able to overmatch the royal armies. So this is the beginning of the successor wars. We're starting to see the splits that are going to eventually result in the battle of Ipsos. As soon as Eumenes heard that the enemy was advancing upon him, he collected his forces, particularly his cavalry, from all sides. Since he could not equal the Macedonian phalanx with his foot soldiers, he made ready a noteworthy corps of horsemen, by means of whom he hoped to defeat those opposed to him. When the forces were near each other, Krateros summoned the whole army to an assembly and spurred them to battle with suitable words, saying that if the soldiers were victorious in the battle, he would give them all the baggage of the enemy to plunder. Now that all had become eager for battle, he drew up the army, taking command of the right wing himself, and giving the command of the left to Neoptolemus. Just a point, in battle array in Greek fashion, the right side is a place of honor. So he's taking the place of honor of the command, the overall command. He had in all 20,000 foot soldiers, chiefly Macedonians, famed for their courage, on whom in particular he placed his hopes of victory, and more than 2,000 horsemen as auxiliaries. Eumenes had 20,000 foot, men of every race, and 5,000 cavalry, by whom he had resolved to decide the encounter. After both leaders had disposed their cavalry on the wings and had ridden far in advance of the line of infantry, Krateros was the first to charge upon the enemy with his picked troops. And he fought admirably, but his horse stumbled, and he fell to the ground, where he was trampled underfoot and ended his life ingloriously, unrecognized in the confusion and disarray of the charge. By his death, the enemy were so encouraged that they rushed upon the mass from every side, and every slaughter ensued. The The right wing, crushed in this way, was compelled to flee to the phalanx of the foot soldiers, overwhelmingly defeated. So, both Diodorus and Arrian tell us that Krateros had ended in this battle in kind of a not very glorious way. He fell off his horse, he got trampled, or in Arrian's account, the Paphlagonians took him out. And he doesn't really get a glorious end. So it's sad for Krateros. That's these two. Okay. Now, here's what Plutarch does. And I'm going to skip through some parts because Plutarch's is long. We're going to take out at least some of the material because I don't want to go on and on forever, but I want you to hear this story from Plutarch. Okay. Notice how Plutarch sets it. Okay. Imagine this in film. Once they had defeated the Greeks, Krateros and Antipatros invaded Asia with the intention of deposing Perdiccas. The rumor was that they were planning to attack Cappadocia, so Perdiccas, who was himself campaigning against Ptolemy, made Eumenes commander-in-chief of the forces in Armenian Cappadocia. He also put his instructions in this regard down in writing with letters to Alcetus and Neoptolemus, telling them to take their orders from Eumenes. And one to Eumenes, telling him that the conduct of the war was entirely at his discretion. Alcetus, however, flatly refused to take part in the campaign on the grounds that the Macedonians in his army were too much in awe of Antipatros to fight him and were so loyal to Krateros that they were ready to receive him with open arms. And Neoptolemus turned traitor. When his intrigues were discovered, he ignored a summons to explain himself and instead drew up his forces for battle. This was the first occasion when Eumenes reaped the benefits of his foresight and planning. For even as his infantry were being defeated, his cavalry first routed Neoptolemus's cavalry and captured the baggage train. And they made a mass charge against Neoptolemus's infantry, who had lost formation while pursuing Eumenes's men, and forced them to surrender. Okay. Then skipping forward just a little bit, Neoptolemus gathered a few of the stragglers and fled to Krateros and Antipatros. They had already contacted Eumenes with an invitation to change sides. He would continue to enjoy the satrapies he currently held, they said, and would also receive further troops and territory from them, provided he healed the rift between himself and Antipatros. And I'm just going to add that Eumenes, you kind of get the feeling as you're reading his biography that he had little battles with a lot of people. Hephaistion was one of them, and Antipatros and some others. So if he healed the rift between himself and Antipatros and did not open one up between himself and Krateros. After hearing their offer, Eumenes replied that his enmity with Antipatros was of such long standing that friendly relations were impossible between them, since Antipatros persisted in treating Eumenes' friends as enemies. But he was ready, he said, to effect a reconciliation between Krateros and Perdiccas. So basically he's inviting Krateros over to the other side, okay, and to bring them together on fair and equitable terms, such that if either of them was wronged by another's aggression, the other would help as long as he had breath. Okay. After receiving this response from Eumenes, Antipatros and his offers were weighing up the entire situation at their leisure when Neoptolemus appeared, reached their camp, in flight from the battlefield. So this is the one he loses against Eumenes. He told them about the engagement and asked for help from both of them, preferably, but at any rate from Krateros, because the Macedonians had an extraordinary longing for him. They had only to see his cap, that causia, the weird hat, and hear his voice, Neoptolemus said, and they would rush to his side armed and ready. What Neoptolemus was saying about Krateros' standing was true. After Alexander's death, he was the one most people longed for. So again, this is Plutarch summarized. They remembered how he had even deliberately incurred Alexander's wrath by repeatedly resisting the king's inclination to play the Persian, and by sticking with traditional Macedonian ways, even as they were being undermined by luxury and affectation. Okay? Remember what I said earlier about Krateros as standing in for Old Macedon? Okay. At the time in question, then, Krateros sent Antipatros to Cilicia, while he and Neoptolemus advanced toward Eumenes with a sizable portion of the army. And I want to point out, none of this other stuff really appears. We hear in Arrian and we hear in Diodorus that, yeah, Krateros has a standing, but they don't frame it this way. Krateros expected to take Eumenes by surprise, with his men relaxed and celebrating their recent victory. Now, we're going to skip over this long dream that Eumenes has, and we're going to skip to the battle. So this is 7 in Eumenes. The force he deployed to do battle with Krateros consisted of 2 mercenary cavalry units, but no Macedonians, since he thought there was a very good chance that if the Macedonian troops recognized Krateros, they would go over to him. The commanders of the cavalry units were Pharnabazus, the son of Artabazus, so this is a Persian. He has a Greek mother, okay, and Phoenix of Tenedos. And Eumenes ordered them to charge at full gallop as soon as the enemy were within sight, without giving them time to maneuver or raise a battle cry, and without receiving any herald they might want to send. So in other words, no negotiations here. Okay. He himself, with his personal guard of 300 horsemen, rode over to the right wing to engage Neoptolemus. Krateros was taken aback to see Eumenes' cavalry once they had crossed the intervening hill and come into view, making a determined and vigorous charge. In other words, no time to talk here. He bitterly reproached Neoptolemus for having misled him into thinking that the Macedonians would desert. And then, urging his officers to show their mettle, he launched his own counterattack. The initial clash was violent. Spears were quickly shattered, and the battle became a sword fight. Krateros' courage would not have disgraced Alexander, and many of his opponents fell before him, but eventually he was wounded by a Thracian. So this is a different, not a Paphlagonian, a Thracian here, who rode at him from the side, and he fell from his horse. No one riding past him realized who it was lying there on the ground, except for Gorgias, one of Eumenes' generals. He dismounted and stood guard over the man who was now in the final throes of a painful death. Okay, I'm going to skip over Eumenes and Neoptolemus, where Neoptolemus has his butt handed to him by Eumenes. After stripping the corpse, Neoptolemus, of his armor, Eumenes remounted his horse and galloped over to the other wing, ignoring the pain from the open wounds in his thigh and arms. He expected to find the enemy still in formation, but learnt instead that Krateros had died. He rode up and dismounted, finding him still alive and conscious. With tears pouring down his face, he grasped his enemy's hand. He gave free rein to his loathing for Neoptolemus and free expression to his sorrow, not just for Krateros' fate, but also for his own sense of duty, which had compelled him to fight a dear friend and either kill or be killed. Okay. This was Eumenes' second victory within about 10 days, and although the combination of skill and courage that had won him, it attracted people's admiration, he also earned a great deal of envy and hatred from allies and enemies alike as an upstart foreigner, a Greek, who had used Macedonian weaponry and manpower to kill the greatest and most distinguished Macedonian of them all. So what we're seeing, and particularly that story in Plutarch, of Krateros' charge. We were told in Diodorus and in Arrian that Krateros fought very well and very bravely. And he turns it into something called an aristeia. That is this great march into battle, this great show of courage and military might that you would find in a Homeric epic that we get for Hector, for Patroclus, for Achilles. So Krateros is being morphed into a heroic style figure before his death. And Plutarch, no, we can't have any of this horse stumbling on the battlefield and Krateros falling off and getting run over, stampeded over, like we're told in Diodorus and backed up by Arrian. Oh, no, we have to have him, suffer, be recognized, and then Eumenes ride in at the last minute, who's the hero of the life of Eumenes, and hold his friend's hand and cry. It like I said, it's great. It's like a Hollywood eat your heart out, and it's very different. So you see what Plutarch has done here. Okay, and this is one of the things to be aware of with Plutarch and all these anecdotes that we read, both in the Alexander and in these lives of other people, he is taking events and he is embellishing them. He's turning them into a great story, Hollywood worthy, film worthy. That's a great film. Now, what Diodorus tells us is a very sad story. Krateros fell off his horse and got trampled. And that was the end of the great Macedonian general. Okay? Not a glorious end. So Plutarch has to tweak it. He has to turn it glorious. He has to change it. That is what you need to be careful of when you're reading the sources. So I wanted to give you an example with these 3 different stories, all of the same event, all of them just a little bit different. Okay? And not just to look at how they're different and to try to reconcile them. That's not what you want to do necessarily. What you want to try to understand is what the author is doing. Why are they telling it that way? Why does Plutarch want to elevate Krateros? Krateros is one of his heroes, and we see this later, or earlier rather, in the life of Alexander. Okay, Krateros represents Macedonia, and the fall of Krateros is kind of symbolically the fall of Macedon, old Macedon, traditional Macedon. Then we descend into the successor wars that will eventually end in the Roman Republic. So these are the things to kind of be aware of and to think about thematically, because these guys are authors. They're not necessarily recording history in the way we think about doing it. Even Arrian, okay? Even Arrian. So, word to the wise, read your sources carefully. Don't necessarily try to reconcile them. Instead, try to understand the source itself and the story they're telling, not just what might really have happened.